First, Democrats today are dealing with the fallout from a medical incident that forced Hillary Clinton to leave a September 11th commemoration ceremony at Ground Zero here in Gotham City early yesterday, hours after video surfaced on social media, which appeared to show Clinton stumbling as she was helped into a black van. Her campaign released a statement saying Clinton had been diagnosed with pneumonia on Friday, had gotten dehydrated at the event and a little bit overheated. Her campaign aides were all over TV today explaining and insisting. They say Clinton has no other illnesses besides the pneumonia, and they acknowledge, though, that the campaign should not have kept the media in the dark.
Well, I think that in retrospect, we could have handled it better in terms of providing more information more quickly. And it is our intention that in the next couple of days, we're going to be releasing additional medical information about Hillary Clinton. There's no other undisclosed condition. The pneumonia is the extent of it. This was the Hillary Clinton that, as Secretary of State, logged all those miles on behalf of representing us abroad. This is somebody whose impulse and instinct is always to press forward. That was her instinct on Friday, even after she was told she has pneumonia. That's the type of president she will be. She will always be looking to squeeze more into a day, to do more, and to push ahead. That's just who she is. It's how she's wired.
New today, this thing. Several super prominent members of Clinton's team refused to answer in live television interviews and press conferences when they were pressed on whether they were even in the loop about her pneumonia diagnosis.
It was interesting because they say pneumonia on Friday, but she was coughing very, very badly a week ago, and even before that, if you remember. This wasn't the first time. So it's very interesting to see what is going on. Like you, I see what I see. The coughing fit was a week ago, so I assume that was pneumonia also. I mean, I would think it would have been, so something's going on, but I just hope she gets well and gets back on the trail. We have to see what's wrong. I mean, we have to see what's wrong. But whatever it is, I'm ready. Whatever it is.
So health is an issue now, right?
I think it's an issue. In fact, this last week, I took a physical, and I'll be releasing when the numbers come in. Hopefully they're going to be good. I think they're going to be good. I feel great.
All right, that was an uncharacteristically subdued Donald Trump. We'll get to him in a minute. We rolled the wrong tape. Here's the right tape of Clinton's associates talking about what they knew and when they knew it.
Did you know on Friday, Robbie, that she was ill? Did you know that she had the diagnosis of pneumonia? And if so, what did you advise her to do?
Well, she obviously saw the doctor on Friday, got the diagnosis of pneumonia, and in consultation with her doctor, she decided to power through that.
Did you know about it?
She didn't. I'm not gonna get into details about who knew her medical information.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say the first time that I talked to Hillary about this was Sunday, so I'll just say it like that. I don't want to get into the character of communications, but I reached out to her as soon as the incident happened on Sunday, and we had a good dialogue there. But other than that, that was the first time we talked about this.
So Trump, as you heard in the sound we played previously, was a lot more restrained than he normally would be in such a circumstance. Clinton, as we heard from Brian Fallon, her spokesman, is expected to release additional medical records later this week and to get back on the trail. So, John, what are the implications of this Clinton health story and the way the Clinton campaign has handled it?
Well, I want to make a couple really obvious points. The first is that how important this story is depends on what Hillary Clinton's actual health situation is, and we have an account of what it is. I have had pneumonia, walking pneumonia, and have had the similar thing happen to me. If that is all this is, this story will subside and not be of any real consequence. But that is an open question. The second thing is that it seems to me that the one thing that comes out of this is that the pressure builds for both of them to be more transparent about their health, that will be a good thing because the country deserves to know more about two people of this age in terms of what their physical condition is if they're about to be president of the United States.
We're now on track to have both campaigns release more information, which, as you said, is good. Let's see what it says. I doubt either of them will have anything disqualifying in their background.
I agree.
The Clinton campaign has once again hurt itself with the press as the watchguards of the public interest in terms of their being transparent. The Trump campaign is not transparent about many things either. But I do believe that this has put her. It is exposed to the extent to which she is somewhat isolated from her team.
Yeah.
Not a surprise to either of us.
No.
But her campaign manager seemed to be telling Kate Snow he didn't know she had pneumonia. Not a total surprise. She's a very private person. But I worry if she's elected president that once again she will, on a regular basis, put her own desire for privacy, human understand that on a human level,
right,
and understand, but on a professional level, if you want to run for president, you want to be president. Unfortunately, you have to give up a little bit of privacy.
Well, look, the reality, though, is this, we interviewed Kellyanne Conway on Morning Joe this morning, and you asked her who the doctor was that had conducted Trump's physical, and she didn't know the answer to that either. So they're sort of similar in this regard, both in terms of their claiming kind of exceptional special status in terms of how they deal with the press and how they deal, I think, with their senior teams.
I'll say one more potential implication. She's missing 2 of the last, whatever it is, 60 days of the campaign. If she continues to get sick, and sometimes it's hard to shake this, off the trail, not good.
But I'm going to add one more thing, which is just for anybody who says this isn't an important issue, just in terms of the political implications, Don Fowler, former DNC chair, is now calling for an HRC, a Hillary Clinton contingency plan. There are some Democrats who are spooked about this. Yeah. Democrats, not just Republicans trying to capitalize here. There are Democrats who are spooked. Okay, that is not all. Obviously, we talked about the other big story, and we'll get to that right now. The Clinton campaign is still trying to clean up her comments that she made on Friday night when she declared at a fundraiser that half of Donald Trump's supporters were, quote, a basket of deplorables. Clinton expressed regret for those remarks a day later, but Trump's team is trying to capitalize in part by putting $2 million behind this new ad in Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida.
Speaking to wealthy donors, Hillary Clinton called tens of millions of Americans deplorable.
You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
People like you, and you. Deplorable. You know what's deplorable? Hillary Clinton viciously demonizing hard-working people like you.
Trump continued that line of attack during his speech to the National Guard Association in Baltimore this afternoon.
Our support comes from every part of America and every walk of life. These were the people Hillary Clinton so viciously demonized. She called these patriotic men and women every vile name in the book. She called them racist, sexist, xenophobic, Islamophobic. She called half of our supporters a basket of deplorables.
So, Mark, what do you think are the long-term political implications of this basket weaving story?
Unlike the health thing, which could be gone by the middle of the week to a large extent, this will go all the way through Election Day. Democrats need to be pressed on what they think of it, just as Republicans were all pressed on what Mitt Romney said about 47%. I think that's a double standard right now that shouldn't exist. They should be asked what they think of what she said. She did apologize. That helped a lot. I think she reflected to a large extent what she actually believes. And I think that the big controversy of overusing the word half will stick with her, and you will see a lot of Trump supporters energized by what she said, and the press will side with Trump on this, which is these days rare.
I want to be clear about a couple things here. It is clear that Donald Trump has traded in racist, bigoted, nativist, xenophobic tropes at various times throughout this campaign. It's also clear that the alt-right makes up some part of the Trump base of support. I think she was 100% right to call it out when she gave that speech about the alt-right and really nailed that right on top of the head. I do not think it's a wise thing to have done, politically or otherwise, to cast a blanket aspersion on what could end up being something like 30 million American voters if he gets the number of votes roughly that Mitt Romney got in 2012. And so I think it's going to gin up. It's going to give Trump a talking point. It's going to rev up the Republican base. Might do a little bit on the Democratic side, but I think if she had it to do over again, she would go back and not say what she said that night, and her apology recognizes or is indicative of the fact that she thinks that she went a little out of her skis on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear they realize it was a mistake. You don't attack the voters.
Right.
And you don't question their motives. And, of course, she said half of them were economically disadvantaged and pitiable, basically, is what she sort of suggested.
Calling out bigotry is good. Instances of bigotry, racism, all those things, good. Blanket aspersions, not good.
All right, so we agree that these two storylines are going to continue at least into the week, despite the Clinton campaigns that tamped them down. Long term, though, I've already said, I think this one presents a bigger threat to her than the health story. Do you agree with that?
Well, I go back to my very first answer. Assuming that this was a garden variety, more or less, case of walking pneumonia, and that is other than that, she's in fine health. Assuming that, and I have no reason not to assume that. Assuming that's true, then yes.
Assume away.
Well, but assuming, you know what I'm saying? Assuming that, yes, this has longer political legs. If for some reason, it turns out she's got other health complications or other health issues, those could be much more significant than this gaffe.
I watched Bill Clinton in 1991 and 1992 campaign terribly sick, as he would say, sick as a dog,
right.
as Donald Trump might say, sick as a dog. And it was hard. It rendered him a less effective candidate. I think you've seen over the last week, I've coughed so hard with allergies that I've gotten pneumonia.
Yes.
So that can happen.
Yes.
But she better hope she doesn't get sick again, because the effect could be keeping her not only off the trail, but more likely to make mistakes.
When I had walking pneumonia and I went down with it, I was on vacation and I spent the better part of a week really depleted, and I'm, 20 years younger than Hillary Clinton is. And so, how long a couple days off the trail will help her, but I don't think she'll be back to full strength by Thursday.
Yep.
And there's not many days left before Election Day. All right, yesterday, when Clinton left Ground Zero, the Ground Zero ceremony early, there was a period of mass confusion among campaign reporters who were covering the event after Clinton's team failed to give the media timely information about their candidate and her whereabouts and what was going on. The traveling press for both the Trump and Clinton campaigns have long complained that neither has agreed to follow the precedent of past nominees when it comes to transparency and the notion of the protective pool. The protective pool relates to the fact that reporters are supposed to be able to observe, some reporters, at least a small subset, are supposed to be able to observe the candidates, all of their public events in case that major news breaks, or let's be frank, something physically threatening happens to either of the candidates. There's a reason, of course, why another name for the protective pool is the body watch. So, Mark, we agree that presidential nominees should have protective pools, just as the president of the United States does. And in the wake of what happened over this weekend, there is going to be more pressure on these campaigns to adhere to the norms. Will either succumb or both succumb to that pressure?
I don't get the sense that they will. I think they've gotten past the conventions. They've gotten into the past Labor Day. I don't think either of them wants a full-time protective pool, and neither of them needs it for the coverage. I just don't see what leverage we have. We have to make clear, this is not about the media. This is about the public interest.
Of course.
These are people who might be president in January. It's a horrible development. Our colleagues have worked hard, who cover the campaigns full time, to try to turn this around. It would be much, much better for everyone, including the candidates, to get used to the notion that if you want to be a major party nominee, you have to let the press be with you. But I don't think it's going to happen, unfortunately. I hope I'm wrong.
There are people out there in the world who, in the same way that they complain that when we want press conferences, we want it because we want to strut and preen, and not because we're trying to we think it's important to hold candidates accountable on camera for the public interest. In the same thing, this is not about like the reporters' comfort or their convenience. This is, stuff can happen, and reporters are trying to do their jobs, and it's, again, in the interest of the public to allow them to try to do their jobs as best they can by creating these situations where they can be with the candidate all the time. I agree with you, though. The leverage, especially with these two candidates, our leverage seems to be less than it's ever been, even if we bang our hands.
There's a lot of hypotheticals. What if that video hadn't existed? A lot of hypotheticals. All right. Up next, we enroll in an electoral college math class. The numbers behind Donald Trump's most likely paths to victory, narrow as they are, when we come back.
Welcome back. There has been a lot of focus lately on Donald Trump's narrow path to winning the White House this November. Based on our many discussions with strategists in both campaigns and outside the campaigns, it would seem that Trump's simplest and likeliest state-by-state victory scenario runs through what we like to call the Big Four. If the Republican nominee keeps the traditionally red states in his column, he will have to win Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina to cross the 270 electoral college threshold. These 4 states would give him 273 and make him our next president of these United States.
All right, but then when you play with the other possibilities after that one, you look at the map, you see just how much of a tough road Trump has. Pennsylvania, it's a state Democrats have won for nearly 3 decades, consistently at the presidential level. It's by far the biggest obstacle to Trump sweeping the Big Four. And if he loses the Keystone State, his next simplest path is not that simple. In addition to winning 3 of the Big Four, Florida, Ohio, and North Carolina, Trump would then have to win 2 additional toss-up states, Iowa and Nevada. Then he'd also have to win New Hampshire, which the Associated Press currently has in the lean Democratic column. And even if he did all that, and that's tough to do, it would be 269 in the Electoral College, and the thing would be thrown to the House, where maybe Trump would win, but be complicated. So to me, the Big Four is really, there's a reason why they're focusing on those 4 states so much, because Iowa, you know, right now, a lot of polls show him ahead.
Yeah.
But winning New Hampshire, and what I like to call the silver state, because I can never remember if it's Nevada or Nevada. Nevada. That's tough. Now, it's not impossible. There are polls that show that state even. So these 2 scenarios are the most likely. But you can see one's got no margin of error, and one's got tied.
New Hampshire has basically been a blue state for a long time. Nevada, the demographics of the state play strongly to Hillary Clinton because the number of Hispanic votes.
Yeah.
That's why you look at Pennsylvania, which is much more in line with the kind of voter that Trump is trying to get at, that white working class voter. I understand why they're trying to do it, but you know, if you listen to David Plouffe and others about what the win number is in Pennsylvania, the registration advantage that Democrats have, why Democrats have won Pennsylvania for these past few cycles, there are strong reasons to think that Pennsylvania will again be fool's gold.
You put the second scenario back up. Now then you go to say, okay, how does Trump maybe get over 269 with that additional map? Well, one thing they talk about is Maine, where the electoral votes are apportioned by CD. They think they could maybe win 1 electoral vote in Maine. That would make it 270 to 268. That'd be one way to do it. You look at the rest of the states, Wisconsin, Virginia, Michigan, Colorado. Those are probably the only ones where he would have a chance maybe to pick it up. But you just see, again, Trump has to do a lot of encroachment into blue states where he's not currently that strong. On the other hand, if he can win 3 of the Big Four, again, a big if, but if he can win those, all states that are somewhat competitive right now,
see, this is why I don't think that
he's got a chance to find it, but it's tough.
This is why I don't think this needle-threading strategy will ultimately work. I think the only way that Trump can win is if there becomes such a wave on his side towards the end that places that aren't currently within reach, like Virginia, which is normally a very, very tight swing state, suddenly Virginia becomes a place he can contest, or Colorado. All right, when we come back, we'll ask our good friend from NBC, Katie Turner, what Pepe the Frog has to do with politics after these words from our sponsors.
There's now NBC News political correspondent Katie Tur, who covers the Trump campaign. So there's this war now to be the most transparent, or at least to appear to be the most transparent. What do we expect on medical records from Trump? He now says he's going to put stuff out.
You know, I've been going back and forth to the campaign about this today, trying to find out when he saw his doctor last. They're just saying last week, but what specifically, what day, what city, which doctor, what he plans on releasing. Is it going to be more than just my cholesterol level is this, my blood pressure is this? Are we going to get family history? Are we going to get his personal history? Has he ever had an operation?
What's your sense of why they're doing it?
They're doing it because they want to seem like Donald Trump is healthier than Hillary Clinton is. And they believe that they can, well, let's find out what they get put out. But so far, the only thing we've gotten from the campaign in regards to his health is a letter saying that he would be the healthiest guy ever to hold the White House.
Right. But do we even know who the doctor was who conducted this physical yet?
No, we don't. We've asked.
I mean, the original guy has been widely derided and mocked given his appearance and some other issues.
We don't know if it is the same gentleman or if it is somebody else that would not suffer the same mocking as this guy did.
Right, so on her health, Donald Trump was uncharacteristically restrained. He didn't completely lay off, and he did more than just say we wish her the best. But obviously, that is not the reaction we would have seen a month ago.
No, certainly, especially because you've seen Giuliani go on the attack on this issue so many times as a surrogate, talking about how she's frail and how she's very sick. And we've heard Donald Trump say repeatedly on the campaign trail that she doesn't have the strength or stamina.
So Nicole Wallace, who we all respect, and others have said there's no Trump 2.0. What you see is what you get. This would seem to me to demonstrate, and you've covered it more than us, as much restraint as he's ever shown in a situation like this.
Yeah, but I wouldn't go so far as to call this Trump 2.0 anyway. I think if you look at the positives and negatives of it, the risk and reward for this, Donald Trump going on the offensive, saying that she's very sick, saying, look, she can't be president because she's not going to make it through the presidency. What reward does he get out of that? Who is he convincing? On the other hand, if he pays respect on 9/11, doesn't go on the attack, continues it for the day, and is measured and wishes her well, a lot of folks out there will say, God, you know, I expected him to go on the attack. I expected him to get very negative. Maybe this is a more mature Donald Trump. So the reward outweighs the risk in this matter.
I want to talk about this Pepe the Frog thing, not just because we teased it, but because it's actually quite fascinating. So explain the Pepe the Frog meme and how it relates to our current events, our current moment.
The Daily Beast and Olivia Nuzzi has a brilliant deep dive into who Pepe the Frog is. But needless to say, it started out as this white nationalist underground symbol. It got co-opted into the mainstream. Katy Perry even tweeted an image of it once. And then now the white nationalist movement is trying to bring it back and make it their own again. And they've done that successfully during this campaign season. And so you'll often see him, I'm sure you guys get this like I do, on your Twitter feed, where people who will be trolling you about Donald Trump and attacking you about Donald Trump will often have that face as their avatar. So it's become very much a dog whistle for the white nationalist movement.
So in the last day, right, Donald Trump Jr. and Roger Stone have both retweeted things that have Pepe the Frog.
Roger Stone tweeted an image of the movie poster, The Expendables, but he called it the deplorables. It's Donald Trump's face. It's Pepe the Frog's face. Donald Trump Jr., Pence. But then there's also Alex Jones, the noted conspiracy theorist, and Milo Yiannopoulos, the alt-right, figurehead, if you will, or this icon of the alt-right. In that image, Donald Trump Jr. posted it on his Instagram. A flood of reports came out that Donald Trump Jr. is posting a white nationalist symbol, and also Milo Yiannopoulos on his own Instagram page. The campaign says that Donald Trump Jr., just like his father, denounces any sort of white supremacy, but it's still on his Instagram page. This is not the first time that they've been connected to white supremacists. Donald Trump has retweeted white supremacists. And it's at the moment Bannon has ties people say to white supremacists in terms of Breitbart trying to expand on their message. Why get into it?
And they're doing it at the moment when they're trying to capitalize on this deplorables thing and feeding into the other narrative.
It doesn't make any sense.
Sloppy at best. Katie Tur, stick around. Go to the soundproof booth. We're going to have you back in a little bit after a block. Up next, take a little bit more look at Hillary Clinton's health issues with some docs right after this.
The New York Post is now reporting that when Hillary Clinton left Ground Zero yesterday, her van was initially directed by Secret Service protocol to an emergency room before it changed course. The story suggests that a campaign operative decided mid-route to go instead to Chelsea Clinton's apartment, ditching a police escort in the process. That story is right up on the front of the New York Post website. We're interested to see whether others will corroborate that story, but we want to convey that to you before we go to our guests who are joining us now to discuss the medical side of this story. Dr. John Torres, an emergency care physician and MSNBC medical contributor. Dr. Torres, just give us a sense of, give us a sense of, in a situation, if you had a patient who was Hillary Clinton's age, who had an incident that occurred like this, would it be your inclination to send that patient directly to the hospital, to an emergency room?
You know, let me put this in perspective. You know, having worked in the emergency room, we frequently get ambulance calls, and the ambulance drivers, the paramedics, the EMTs, they'll say, you know, here's the situation. We have a 68-year-old female that collapsed due to heat environment, maybe some other issues going on, has pneumonia. My advice would be bring them to the emergency room. We need to find out why they collapsed. We need to recover them, meaning rehydrate them, probably IV fluids, and then basically go from there to make sure nothing dangerous happens. So to some extent, I am surprised that she got redirected from the emergency room, because that would be the step I would think would be logical in a situation like this.
Doctor, would you think if we asked 100 of your colleagues, all 100 would agree, or is it maybe a little bit matter of judgment and opinion?
You know, well, one thing, I don't think 100 doctors are going to agree on anything, but I think at least 98 of them would agree on this and say, yeah, definitely, especially, you know, given the circumstances she's had, given the fact that, you know, looking at the video and having 20/20 hindsight, she collapsed in that video, 68-year-old female, even without knowing the pneumonia part of it, you'd want to find out why she collapsed and correct whatever is wrong at that time, because that's not normal.
And if she'd been your patient on Friday and you diagnosed her with pneumonia, lots of people, whatever age, who are hardworking, involved in a demanding profession, they work through illness. You know, I think all three of us probably have worked when others might not have. So what would you have told her on Friday, a 68-year-old woman with pneumonia, if she said, I'm about to go on a cross-country trip?
And anybody, 68-year-old woman, 68-year-old man, I would say the same thing. I'm like, here's the deal. Your body needs time to recuperate. 3 to 4 days, you need to get good rest. I'm not talking bed rest, but I'm talking good rest, away from exhaustion, away from stress. If you don't get that, two things might happen. Number one, it's probably going to take a lot longer to recover. Instead of 10 days to 2 weeks, we're talking maybe 3 or 4 weeks. Number two, the other thing that might happen is at some point your body's going to get so exhausted and so worn down, it's going to tell you, it's over. It's time to relax. I'm going to make you relax right now. And I think that's what we saw there, that her body got to the point where it said, you're not choosing to relax. I'm going to make you relax. And I think that's what happened.
Dr. Torres, let me ask you a little bit about the contagiousness question around pneumonia. The campaign says that Hillary Clinton is not contagious, yet we've now had reports that multiple campaign staffers also are sick, maybe with similar or exactly the same thing. And Chuck Schumer now is saying he has pneumonia. Just explain the contagiousness of pneumonia to the extent that it exists.
And it's always kind of the chicken and egg thing, you know, who gave what to whom. And you can imagine during a campaign, she's doing a lot of handshaking, she's doing a lot of baby kissing, all those things where germs spread. This happens quite often, and we all are encompassed by germs. We all touch germs all the time. Out of 10 people who might get these germs, one might develop pneumonia, and that could be for a variety of different reasons. Once you get pneumonia, you're not going to give somebody else pneumonia, but you might pass on that bacteria or virus that causes it, and then it's up to their body to fight it off and hopefully not develop pneumonia. You can also imagine her crew there is basically campaign staff. They're in an enclosed environment, frequently on train or buses and planes, you know, where they're passing these germs among each other. And the stress of the situation, it exhausts them, it brings their immune system down. So that means they're just open up to more of these illnesses. So it doesn't surprise me that they got more sick over time, and that sickness seems to be spreading around the campaign staff. Again, it's one of those things that pneumonia is not contagious in and of itself, but that bacteria that causes it can float around.
Hillary Clinton's released more medical data than Donald Trump, but neither of them has released as much as we've seen from some past candidates. What are the things you think are absolute bottom line that must be released in order to give the public confidence that this is a complete sense of that person's current medical status and medical history?
And as a doctor, the first thing I ask my patients for is, what's your past medical history? What things have you had in the past? What illnesses have you had? What surgeries have you had? What accidents have you had that could be contributing to what's going on right now? On top of that, I'd also want to know, what screening tests have you gone under? And if you've had screening tests, we're talking colonoscopy, mammograms, any of these kind of screening tests, what have they shown? And are you still being followed because of that? Have you had any biopsies because of that? So just basically a more thorough history. What medicines are you on right now? What have you been in the past? Why were you able to come off of them? Like you said, we've got some information from them, but not nearly enough to make good decisions.
Let's talk about colonoscopies. Given their ages, they're both about 70. How many colonoscopies should they have had? When should they have most recently had one?
What the recommendations are to get one when you're 50, unless you have higher risk factors. Start when you're 50, and depending on that one, if that's a clean colonoscopy, they usually say 10 years later, so get one when you're 60. If you've had some issues where they saw in the first colonoscopy, they might say every 2 or 3 years after that. And again, we don't know because we haven't gotten that information, so at a minimum, probably 2 colonoscopies, but possibly even more.
Really basic question here. I mean, again, we understand Hillary Clinton's running for president. There aren't that many days left. She's obviously eager to get back on the campaign trail. Her campaign says that, and we believe it, given her work ethic. But if you had a patient who was not running for president, and they had just, what happened to them is what happened to her yesterday, how long would you give them? Would you kind of compel them to be on bed rest before you let them go back to work?
And what I tell my patients is, number one, you don't need to be on bed rest per se. You just need to be on rest, which means, you know, putter around the house, do crossword puzzles, watch TV, sit on the couch, those types of things. About 3 to 4 days of that kind of rest, and then a full 2 weeks of just a low intensity work, not very strenuous work, not very exhausting work. And you know, she's on a campaign right now, so she has to get out there and do what she has to do. I have other patients that are working and they need to put food on the table, so they have to get back to work. I tell them the same thing. If you don't rest, chances are you're going to extend this, and chances are you might get to the point where your body says, we're going to make you rest.
Right. So she's back at full steam in just 2 or 3 days. You're saying there's some risk. You'd think there might be a risk that she has, that this kind of recurs and gives her problems a little further down the road?
Definitely, because she has not recovered from this pneumonia in 2 or 3 days. It takes a good 10 days to 2 weeks to recover from this. She's on antibiotics, which is great. She's got a great medical staff taking care of her. But at the same time, her body needs that time to recover. And if she doesn't give her body time to recover, it's going to fight back. It's going to say, you know, things are going to happen. It's going to take longer to recover, or we might see what happened again.
Do plane flights retard recovery from pneumonia?
Well, the plane flights might actually help a little bit. You do get some jet lag depending on where you're going, which can basically exhaust you to a certain extent. And we've all been on these trips where you go out to the airport, and by the time you get to wherever you're going a few hours away, you're just tired. But at the same time, it does give her that opportunity to rest. It gets her that opportunity to get away from the crowds and the public and all the things she has to do, where she has to basically bring her A game every single time. So it gives her that opportunity to rest, which should help her recover. And so hopefully, again, she can do that, but more hopefully she can just get those time periods where she can just rest and get away from it all.
All right. Dr. John Torres, thank you so much for coming on the show. Coming up, we will talk to a couple of Democratic strategists about the state of Hillary Clinton's campaign. And if you happen to be watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We will be right back.
With us now from Washington, D.C., Cornell Belcher, the Democratic pollster and strategist. Joining us here in studio, Liz Smith, a Democratic strategist, the former deputy campaign manager for Martin O'Malley's presidential campaign. Liz was also the director of rapid response for President Obama's 2012 campaign, and Katie Tur of NBC News is back with us. Cornell Belcher, let me ask you first, which of the two things currently going on with the Clinton campaign, her health or the remarks she made about Donald Trump supporters, do you think represents a bigger threat to her candidacy now?
I don't, her health is an issue, but I'm not a doctor. I don't want to talk about that. I don't think that the remarks that she made about Donald Trump's voters actually offend the large swath of voters that were part of the Obama coalition that she actually needs to win over. I think that's more of a problem for, those people who were offended by those remarks, they were never going to vote for Hillary Clinton in the first place. So I'm worried more about those voters, particularly those young voters who are part of the Barack Obama coalition, who are less than enthusiastic right now.
Liz, what do you think about how, on this health thing, just tell me how you, from the standpoint of as a communications professional that you are, how do you think they handled the day yesterday?
I think they have even admitted not well. Look, they faced a pretty tough choice here from the beginning. One of the options here was to be transparent. And if they were and said up front that she had pneumonia, they would have emboldened people like Rudy Giuliani and the quacks out there, not about who have MDs, who are going out there and saying all these irresponsible things on TV. But the way they chose to handle it was not to be transparent, and the way it unfolded was basically a worst-case scenario. I don't think you could have scripted it worse. And the problem there is not necessarily the question about her health, is it underscores her biggest weakness as a candidate, that people think she is untrustworthy and that she's not transparent. And now she's going to have to go out and release her medical records anyway. So it shows why transparency, you might take a hit in the short run, but in the long run, it's a better policy.
Cornell, it's Katie Tur. I've got a question for you. Who wakes up and says, Hillary Clinton isn't well, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump?
I don't think anyone that's a persuadable voter wakes up and thinks that. I think the problem, and I think you're spot on with this, I think the problem is it does reinforce a narrative that the Trump campaign is trying to run with. Look, the Republicans going back for a long time now, and they certainly did it under George Bush, they believe in the trait of strength in a way that we Democrats have not believed in that strength. They would argue that the trait strength is the most important strength for a presidential candidate, and what Donald Trump is certainly trying to do is sort of present himself as a strong candidate, Putin-like, if you will, and while saying that, she's weak, she doesn't look like presidential, and by the way, he's done this fairly successfully through the primary. I still to this day can't believe that Jeb Bush was undone by low energy.
And, just to the health point, the American people do have a lot of common sense. They know that the people running for president aren't superhuman, and they are allowed to get sick. So I think it was, a little bit too protective, a little bit too much of the Clinton people getting in their bunker mentality, and not giving the American people the benefit of the doubt that they would take her word for it and understand that she has a very taxing schedule.
I want to ask you both. Cornell Belcher first, again, is a bit of a hypothetical, but it may correlate with the reality. If you had a choice between sending your candidate to the hospital, which was the recommendation of medical professionals, or someplace else that wouldn't cause a headline, candidate goes to hospital, would you ever say to the candidate, yeah, you should avoid the public hit, don't go to the hospital?
You got to go to the hospital and be transparent. But onto this point that you guys were covering earlier, they see both campaigns in his campaigns on both sides and up and down the ticket now, they see less and less reason to talk more and more to you all because we have these 1,000 content providers all over the place that we can talk to in our silos, and they don't have to talk to you guys as much.
Liz, I'm not saying this is what happened, but just hypothetically, a candidate said to you, I don't want to go to the hospital, it'll look bad. I want to go to somebody's house and just rest and relax. And the doctor says you should really be going to the hospital. What would you advise a candidate?
I would go with the doctor. And you know what? Any candidate I've worked for would tell you I have no problem of standing up to them and telling them what to do. Right. Whether they take my advice or not is up to them. But I would tell them to do what the doctor did and to be more transparent. And look, let me just make one more point here because it's been left out of the discussion, is Donald Trump, we can talk about Hillary Clinton's transparency issues, but Donald Trump still is the least transparent candidate in modern history. no tax returns, still no medical records. I know he's saying he's going to release them Thursday, but it's not like she's running against someone who's a perfect messenger on this issue.
Well, because of that, though, why is she not leading by a larger margin? If he is the least transparent, if he is dealing in deplorables, which is what she says, if these campaign rallies get violent, if he says the wrong thing pretty consistently, why is this lead so small?
Neither of the candidates are perfect. I mean, they're the most unpopular candidates in history. So she is our candidate, though, and I think she's a vastly better and more qualified candidate than Donald Trump. But you know, her campaign needs to understand that she does have these weaknesses and not reinforce them, and actually try to help Americans trust her more. And you can do that by being a little bit more transparent.
Cornell, let me come back to you to the question that Mark asked you a different way, the question he asked you at the very top of the segment here, which is about the baskets and the deplorables. You said that you didn't think that anybody who was offended by that would have been likely to vote for Hillary Clinton anyway. There is another set there, right? There's the Democratic base, and then there's also kind of mainstream Republicans who are uncomfortable with Donald Trump. Do you think that by her saying these things, she gets maybe some benefit, either ginning up the Democratic base or reminding mainstream Republicans of the kind of people that Donald Trump consorts with?
First, I think if you look at the Washington Post poll, and it showed that, 60% of voters out there think that Donald Trump, in fact, does have bias against women and minorities. So it's not like she's saying something that's out of the mainstream. But the problem is, and this we see this time and time with Democrats, is sometimes we'll pull back, right? We'll say something and then we'll pull back, and that's a problem, especially for these younger voters in the Democratic base who say, we want people who will fight, stand up for what you believe in, and fight, and that also plays into the whole strength narrative.
All right, everybody stay with us. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about some research Cornell Belcher did on the Obama coalition and Hillary Clinton's chances of reassembling it right after this.
We are back with Democratic strategist Cornell Belcher in D.C. and Liz Smith here in the studio, also Katie Tur of NBC News helping us out for the moment. Cornell, one of the things we wanted to talk to you about was this research you've been doing. Jonathan Martin wrote about it in the New York Times. Some focus groups you did and some polling that you did that identified some problems that Hillary Clinton seems to be having with African-American voters, in particular with millennial African-American voters. Tell us about that.
Well, first, my fellow political consultant, appreciate this. You never want to wake up one morning and find your confidential work has been leaked and it's on the front page of the New York Times. That's a nightmare. But that said, the problem is you do see with younger voters more broadly, and particularly younger African Americans. Look, in the Obama campaign, I was in 08. We expanded the electorate. And, you know, early on in the Obama campaign, we talked about we're not going to be able to beat Hillary Clinton in the primary and certainly not going to be able to win the general election if we don't expand the electorate. 11% of our vote in 2008 were new voters. 62% of those new voters were, in fact, under 35. And they looked like the new ascending America. They were browner than the rest of America. So what does that look like in the real world? In the real world, in battleground states, that means, you know, as opposed to Ohio being 12% African American, Ohio is now 15% African American, and we can get roughly the same percentage of the white vote as Kerry did and win. If those voters don't come back and those voters don't show back up, you know, you have the John Kerry electorate again as opposed to Barack Obama electorate again. And I think, to me, that's the #1 problem for Democrats, that if she loses, it's because she has a John Kerry electorate and not more of our electorate. Now, these young voters, they have been cynical. I'm going to get in the weeds in a little bit. If you go back, you know, I was also Howard Dean's poster at the DNC. If you go back and talk to younger voters, you know, coming out of 2004, 2005, it wasn't that they didn't want to, you know, take part in change and do things for the community. They just didn't think politics was a vehicle for it, and they were cynical about the process, and they would talk about the recount and how Bush had stole that. In 2008, 2012, Barack Obama was a different kind of candidate. He inspired them. They fell in love. The younger voters want to be in love. I think, regardless if it's Hillary Clinton or if it's Joe Biden or whoever, they were going to have a hard time, you know, again, sort of turning on these young voters who are part of this Obama coalition, because, again, they were not, and this is what I told Howard Dean at the end of his chairmanship, you know, we expanded the electorate with a lot of voters who aren't necessarily Democratic voters. They're Obama voters, and we have to know the difference, and we will struggle unless we reconnect with them.
Now, if she gets 50% of those voters or 75% of those voters, is that enough to overcome the large turnout of potentially white, uneducated males that the Donald Trump camp is trying to capitalize on?
Well, that's the real problem. It's not even what her winning percentage is. I mean, let's say she gets somewhere close to the percentage that Barack Obama got. It's about what the proportion of the electorate is, right? So on election day, if Ohio, you know, if Ohio is not, if African Americans aren't making up 15, 16% of that electorate, and instead they're making up 10 or 11% of that electorate, it becomes really difficult for her to win Ohio, because even looking in the polls right now, even again the Post poll just came out, it's not like she's performing much better than Barack Obama did among white voters. In the Post poll, she's at what, 36 or 37%. Right. So it's not like she's getting 45, 46, 47% of the white vote. She's not overperforming there, so she really does need this cohort.
Liz, over in Brooklyn, the campaign is filled with millennials trying to figure out how to sell Hillary Clinton to their fellow millennials. What more could they be doing?
Well, I think, and you know, Cornell, I understand why it must have been jarring to see the results of your focus group leak. But as a Democrat, I would recommend all my fellow Democrats to read the findings there, because I think there are lessons there, not just for Hillary Clinton, but for Democratic campaigns across the country. Now, to your question, I think they should follow the advice of and the lessons that we've learned.
But how do you take the Clinton brand and appeal to millennials and African American millennials?
This is the deal. Barack Obama was a once-in-a-lifetime candidate. She is not going to have the same inspirational appeal with young people that he did. Other candidates wouldn't have either. Again, once-lifetime candidate. What I do think she should do, and I think, again, something that we learned from Cornell's findings, is she needs to go out and make an affirmative case for herself. And that's part of getting people inspired to vote for her. Right now, you know, the campaign has been a little bit of a dogfight, and it's been, you know, a back and forth of these personal insults, and she's not laying out a case for why young black voters should vote for her. She's not talking about criminal justice reform. She's not talking about issues that they care about. So.
Okay. Liz Smith, we can talk about this all day, and maybe we will on another day. Liz Smith, Cordell Belcher, Katie Tur, thank you all. We'll be right back.
covering all the latest on Hillary Clinton and her campaign at BloombergPolitics.com.
We sure are.
Coming up on Bloomberg Television, Facebook's VP of Messaging Products. I love messaging products. It's going to be on Bloomberg West. His name is David Marcus.
How many different messaging products do you use?
More than I can name in the remaining seconds. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of first word news. President Obama and congressional leaders are meeting at the White House trying to avert a government shutdown at the end of the month. Among the items on the agenda, a funding bill to fight the Zika virus. The government bill is the only must-pass piece of legislation ahead of the November presidential election. The ceasefire in Syria, brokered over the weekend by Washington and Moscow, is underway. The agreement provides a window for potential